He didn't slam the door when he left. There was no echo, no dramatic exit, just a quiet hand, turning the knob, closing it gently behind him. Not because he wanted to make a statement, but because he didn't need to anymore. There was no shouting, no final argument, no need to explain himself. He didn't walk out with anger in his chest, he walked out with clarity in his soul. Because when a man realizes he's been staying where he's no longer seen, he doesn't ask to be noticed. He simply walks. And what happens next? He disappears for a while, not to hide, but to rebuild. The world sees a man like that and calls him distant, but they don't know what solitude made him. They don't see the strength that comes from walking away without bitterness, only balance. He didn't leave to prove a point, he left to protect his peace, and now he's more grounded, more unshakable, more dangerous not to others, but to anything that ever tried to control him. Let's take a closer look at what really happens when a man stops chasing and starts choosing. There was a time when he thought explaining himself would bring closeness. He believed that if he just found the right words, if he could say it clearly enough, calmly enough, kindly enough, maybe she would understand. Maybe they'd meet in the middle. So he tried. He explained why he needed space after long days, why his silence wasn't distance but recovery, why certain things made him quiet, not cold. He explained his past, his fears, his wounds. At first she listened, but soon the listening turned into interruptions. The questions felt more like tests. And his explanations, they started to sound like defense. Not once, not twice, but over and over, until one night, after repeating the same truth in different words, he sat in silence and realized something. Explaining himself didn't bring understanding. It only drained him. She wasn't hearing to connect. She was hearing to respond, to react, to reframe. That was the moment it changed. He stopped chasing clarity in conversation, stopped offering his heart like a lesson plan, stopped believing that love required translation. Because when you're constantly asked to explain your nature, what you're really being told is who you are, isn't acceptable as it island. So he went quiet, not out of spite but out of wisdom. Because sometimes silence isn't avoidance, it's protection, it's preservation, it's the beginning of healing. And when a man stops explaining, he doesn't disappear. He simply returns to the version of himself that doesn't need permission to exist. But once the explanations stop, something surprising begins. In the beginning, the silence felt heavy. It followed him into every room, settled into the corners of his home like dust he couldn't clean. Mornings were the hardest. No footsteps, no voices, no one asking, "Are you okay?" The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was sharp. It echoed with everything left unsaid. He used to fill the space, turned on the television just to hear something, opened apps he didn't care about, scrolled through timelines that only made him feel more distant. He feared the silence because in it, he had to sit with himself, and for a while he wasn't sure he liked the company. But then slowly the silence changed. It stopped screaming, stopped accusing, stopped reminding him of what he lost. Instead it started whispering, gently, patiently. It reminded him that he didn't need noise to feel alive. He needed stillness to remember what life actually felt like. He began to move differently, made coffee slower, took walks without headphones, watched the sky change color instead of checking the time. He realized silence wasn't the enemy. It was the teacher, the healer. It was the mirror no one else held up for him. The one that didn't flatter, didn't rush, didn't ask anything except honesty. And in that space he finally heard himself. Not the version others wanted, not the version that smiled through fatigue, but the voice he'd buried years ago beneath responsibility, performance, and the need to be enough. That voice said, "You're allowed to rest now. You're allowed to not explain. You're allowed to be." So he kept listening, and the more he listened, the more he came back to life. And through that silence, he discovered something else. He used to shape himself for the crowd, not out of vanity but out of survival. He laughed when he didn't find it funny, agreed when he didn't fully believe, went along just to keep the peace. Because when the world is always watching, you begin to live like a mirror, only reflecting what others want to see. He knew how to play the role, the strong one, the gentleman, the fixer, the one who never asked for anything in return. But something shifted when the room emptied, when the audience faded, when the people he used to bend for stopped looking altogether. Without anyone watching, he no longer had to perform. He didn't have to answer texts right away, didn't have to attend every birthday, didn't have to smile through stories that bored him to the bone. He could finally rest. Not the kind of rest that comes from sleep, but the kind that comes from no longer pretending. That's when he started to live. Not as someone's partner, not as someone's support system, not as someone's version of good enough. He started to live as himself, the man who enjoys silence more than applause, the man who walks without explaining where he's going, the man who creates not for approval, but because his hands are steady and his heart is full. He didn't need validation anymore. He needed authenticity, and in the absence of all the eyes watching, he finally saw himself. But the more real he became, the more the world misread him. They say he's cold now, hard to reach, too quiet, too calm. But what they're really saying is he no longer reacts the way he used to. He no longer rushes to fix what others break, no longer softens his tone to protect fragile egos, no longer stretches himself to be liked, understood, or approved. He's not cold, he's calibrated. Every word, every movement, every decision measured. He doesn't raise his voice not because he's indifferent, but because he's learned that volume doesn't equal value. He doesn't rush to respond, not because he's passive, but because some things simply don't deserve a reaction. They used to mistake his silence for thoughtfulness. Now they call it distance. But he knows what they don't. That the man who once gave everything, his energy, his time, his presence, now gives with intention. He protects his mornings, chooses his conversations, saves his strength for things that build, not break. They call that cold, but it's not. It's the cost of clarity. Because when a man wakes up from the noise, from the applause, the pressure, the endless performance, he doesn't go back to who he was. He becomes sharper, slower, more precise. And that kind of man unnerves people, not because he's cruel, but because he no longer bends to be understood. Because once a man stops bending, something dangerous happens. He used to be drawn in by beauty, by charm, by the promise of connection wrapped in flattery. He used to feel pulled by attention even when it wasn't real, the quick compliments, the lingering looks, the familiar games. But not anymore, because now he sees through the surface, not cynically but clearly. You can't seduce him with compliments. He's heard them all before. They sound nice, but they no longer touch him because his worth is no longer waiting for someone else to name it. You can't bait him with silence. He doesn't panic when someone pulls away. He doesn't chase after people who test him by withholding affection. He's not trying to pass anyone's emotional exam. He doesn't chase, he chooses. He chooses energy that feels calm, not chaotic. He chooses presence over performance. He chooses actions over promises. That discipline, it didn't come easy. It was built from the ashes of overgiving, overcompensating, overexplaining. He learned the hard way that being available to everyone makes you invisible to yourself. So now his availability is earned. His time is protected. His peace is guarded. He's no longer a man who reacts, he observes. He no longer says yes to keep the peace, he says no to protect it. And for those who used to manipulate with games, guilt, or charm, they find nothing to push against now. No weak points, no cracks. Because self-discipline isn't about control over others. It's about full control over self. And that kind of control you can't touch. And what happens when a man starts choosing? There was a time when he believed love was something to win. That if he said the right things, showed up enough, sacrificed just the right pieces of himself, maybe he'd be chosen. Maybe he'd finally be seen as the one. So he gave. He waited. He tried harder than most would ever know. But over time he started to feel something unsettling. The more he tried to win someone else, the more he lost himself. He became quieter, smaller, nicer than he felt, more agreeable than he wanted to be. And even when he got what he thought he wanted, the attention, the affection, the title, it came with a weight he couldn't carry, because deep down he knew it wasn't real if he had to perform for it. Now he doesn't need to win anyone. He doesn't need to be admired. He doesn't need to be needed. He just needs to remain whole. That's the real shift. He's not proving his worth anymore. He's protecting it. He's not asking to be chosen. He's already chosen himself, and that choice changed everything. It made him slower to open but faster to walk away. It made him gentler with others but firmer with his own boundaries. It made him honest not to impress but to stay in alignment. He doesn't date to fill a void. He doesn't speak to be liked. He doesn't explain to be understood. He simply lives, in his own skin, at his own pace, and with a quiet kind of confidence that doesn't need an audience. But make no mistake, he still believes in love.